Hi, Angelo John Lewis here for the Sacred Inclusion Network. In case you're not familiar with us, the Sacred Inclusion Network is a network of people who are unaffiliated spiritual seekers who wish to change the world in a certain way. And our focus is to giving people tools as to how to do that. Today, I'm honored to interview Dr. Marques Redd, who is a traditional African cosmologist, independent scholar, and multimedia artist. The foundation of his work is a reclamation, modernization, and extension of traditional African knowledge systems, particularly from ancient Egypt and West African contexts. And he seeks every medium he can, film, sculpture, academic scholarship, spiritual retreats, performance, public installation, to bring the multidimensional depths of African cosmologies to the 21st century world. On October 15th, Marques will facilitate an online exploration for the Spiritual Inclusion Network called Activating Egyptian Spirituality. In that exploration, he'll provide a map for activating ancient Egyptian rituals that you can use in your own spiritual practice. The exploration will be grounded in guided meditations and an exploration of how to use hieroglyphs as shamanic tools. Welcome, Marques.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Marques, I think I'd like to get a start by asking you to talk about a little bit about your spiritual backstory, which means, you're involved in a relatively arcane set of things, like African cosmology. Tell me about how you got involved in it and how it's impacted your spiritual life.
Perfect. That's a very broad question. So hopefully I can give a sharp and condensed answer. I would say I was always obsessed with ancient Egypt, even when I was a kid. Some of my memories from middle school growing up in Macon, Georgia, would be going to the library after class was over to find all of the books about ancient Egypt that I could. So I was reading everything from the big picture coffee table books to anthropology and Egyptological reports. And even when I went to Harvard as an undergrad, I decided that this would be a major area that I would focus on academically. I did a senior thesis on the influence of ancient Egypt in Plato's philosophy, and then went to UC Berkeley for a PhD, where I still focus on the same topic, looking at the influence of Egypt on 19th century literature. But it was also in California that I first connected with a living African spiritual system. So I joined a house that was dedicated to Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban spiritual system that's influenced by Yoruba and other West African cultures. And I took my actual first trips to Cuba and to Egypt. And I think it was that connection between a very vibrant, living African spiritual system with an ancient one, where I realized that I could understand both much better. I could see in the ancient texts what kinds of rituals were being alluded to or hinted at. But then when I came to the contemporary moment, I could understand the richness of the cosmology and the symbolism that supported some of the things that were being done. So I was saying around 2012, having this fusion launched an even deeper exploration of ancient Egypt for me. And ever since, it's been the base of my intellectual, artistic, and spiritual work.
Say a little bit about your spiritual work. I mean, because the way you conveyed it, it's sort of like an intellectual pursuit, like you study all these different things and cosmologies, but I get from talking to you previously that it's not just that, it's more than that for you. I want to know is how all this stuff impacts your personal, individual, spiritual life. What that looks like.
The spiritual practice is really dedicated to a hyper awareness about nature, a hyper awareness about cycles, and a hyper awareness about how to live a life that is in tune with divine harmony. So I would say I'm constantly thinking about what are the particular energies of the day? What are the energies of the lunar cycle that we're in? What are the yearly energies of where we are in relationship to, let's say, the equinoxes and solstices? What are the energies or the spiritual forces that are controlling and shaping and influencing the different projects I'm a part of, whether it's an art project, whether it's a book that I'm writing, whether it's a relationship that I'm trying to build with someone. It really is a system about how can you activate the divine self at all points in time, and how can one understand that life itself is a ritual and is contained by many rituals inside of that. I mean, so our whole existence is about figuring out how to open a path for the divine to kind of flow through us in all moments and in all situations.
Oh, beautiful. As you know, most people in the United States, they're familiar with Christianity, they're familiar with Judaism. Maybe they have some knowledge of Islam, for example, probably not. But I would venture to say that most people know nothing about African spirituality, African cosmology. So I'm wondering, what is your sense as to what's unique about it, and what it specifically has to offer? I guess in the world stage, what's missing in the general exploration of what it means to be human, what it means to be spiritual, that might be perhaps fulfilled by some sort of knowledge or exploration of these African cosmological systems.
Yeah. So for the first part around what is unique about these systems, I think they're important because they encapsulate so much of the original spiritual impulses of humanity. I mean, so as we know, modern Homo sapiens developed or emerged around, let's say, 300,000 years ago. But it wasn't until, let's say, 60,000 years ago where humans actually started to leave Africa to explore other parts of the world. So we have several 100,000 years where the human species was an African one. And all of the formation of the human psyche, the formation of understanding our relationship to the divine, our early attempts to actually build culture itself as a form that can sustain and elevate us, all of that happened on the African continent and in these early African systems. So the reason why I'm attracted to African spiritual systems is that you can still see the remnants of these early understandings of what it means to be human and conceptions of the divine that actually, in a deeper sense, made us human and made us into the beings and creatures that we are today. So there's something powerful about being able to tap into the original source that's able to really activate and call on the most original ancestors that allowed us a world and a tamed nature for us to even have the lives that we have today. And also, so many of these systems are about a holism directed towards expanding consciousness. So you see moments where medicine is thought about as being connected to agriculture, which is connected to literature, which is connected to astronomy, which is connected to painting, which is connected to politics. So there is a very advanced understanding of knowledge where all of the different areas of human endeavor are conceived of as these interconnected ways of, again, expanding human consciousness, transforming humans into divine beings. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a aesthetic beauty to these systems. There's a deep intellectual complexity. There's a rich thinking about human potential and human possibility. And these systems also provide a challenge to us. Can we really reach down into the very depths of our being? And can we reach upward into the absolute heights of human attainment? And it provides a map on how to do so.
Marcus, there's a certain potency about ancient Egypt and how its philosophies, cultures, and artifacts have lived for so many, many years. You talked about, going to the library and reading books about Egypt. I don't think you're unique in that regard. I wonder if you could talk about why you think this fascination exists. What is its relevance for the modern world, really?
Yeah, it really is our first major civilization. I mean, it's a culmination and the formalization of hundreds of thousands of years of our early human development, and even the millions of years of pre-hominid development to even get us to the space of Homo sapiens. I mean, you see like the first written text, the first calendars. I mean, so many different firsts. Um, but I would say Egypt gets really to the core and the mystery of who we are. I would say in this particular cultural context, you see the first articulation of the immortality of the human spirit. I mean, that had not really been actively articulated in textual form and in cultural form before Egypt. I mean, so this understanding for the first time about immortality and that the soul doesn't die with the body is actually a thought that makes us human. Our attempt to understand how we live beyond ourselves is really what kind of creates us as cultural beings. I mean, so anytime we think about culture, anytime we think about, oh, what is my legacy going to be? What am I going to write? Or what am I going to do? Or what projects will I work on that will last beyond me? We're already asking an Egyptian question. I mean, when you see, let's say, the pyramid texts, I mean, these are like literally the first literary texts in our global literary tradition. These texts are carved and literally carved into the walls of stone. And they're about the quest for transcendence. They're about the quest for joining the deities in the heavens, about living for millions and millions of years. And we still see these texts. So we have records of this life from, let's say, 2800 BC. I mean, so there's something sublime about our fundamental nature and questions about who we are and why we're here and what can we possibly do that will always resonate with human beings. I mean, and then there's so many different elements to Egyptian culture that remind us of these dynamics so that we have to think about it at all turns. I mean, even thinking about the pyramids and the monumentality of them. I mean, for many thousands of years, these were the tallest structures on the planet. And even still, they've lasted for so long. I mean, so one cannot look at them without being provoked into deep reflections around who we are as a people, who we are as living beings. I mean, you're provoked into a state of wonder, really. It's really a shock and awe. I mean, like, how could these things have been created? How could these things have lasted so long? How can these things speak so deeply to what human possibility is? I mean, so, and it's a weird way in which we still have to catch up to Egypt in the sense that it's an open question if we could build pyramids of that size and scale today with our modern engineering techniques. It's a question around whether we can come up with more intensely rich pictures of the afterlife and what happens after death. So all of these things will constantly shake and inspire us and move us into sheer wonder around who we are as people, as a culture, as a species.
Yeah, I mean, it's something obviously you studied the influence of Egyptian thought. It motivated. I mean, Plato was interested in it. And to some extent, it underlies all of what we call philosophy, for example. It's not, it didn't stop there.
Yeah, well, in positive and in negative ways. I mean, yeah, this will take the conversation into a whole different direction. I mean, but certainly, I mean, you could see even figures like the 19th century German philosopher Hegel struggling with trying to understand the meaning of the Sphinx, the meaning of the pyramids, down to our contemporary moment with French philosophers like Derrida thinking about hieroglyphs and understandings of how metaphysics is wrapped into understandings of language. I mean, so it's an endless it's an endless topic.
You know, it seems like I would be remiss to at least not bring up the fact that you're quite an accomplished artist, and if I may say so, I don't think you'd mind if I say so. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, maybe in the context of this film that you've been involved in. You gave us a sense as to how this sort of cosmology unfolds, how it might be utilized and sort of understood. And I know, and I've watched your most recent film, which I'm not going to mispronounce, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe your sense of being an artist, what that means for you in terms of your spiritual life, and maybe you could give us a little bit of a sense of the film. It deals with a particular archetype. It's a broad question, but you can handle
Yeah,
it.
perfect. So I released a film called Obi Umbu, or The Primordial House, in 2020 with my co-director Mikel Lewonum. So it is a 30-minute experimental dance film. We have two dancers from Pittsburgh Ballet Theater who are enacting this particular West African Igbo myth about the creation of the world. So they are covered in this fluorescent body paint, and the whole film was shot in under black light to give this cosmic ambiance and to portray the splendor and the gravity of these mythic figures. And the film turns around this mysterious chamber that's in the center of the primordial house. We have one of the deities who's dancing in and out of the house, doing the secret work. His counterpart, his female counterpart, is intrigued by what's happening in this mysterious space, and she decides to go into it, which leads to a whole host of consequences for the emergence of the world. So this project was part of, again, my larger goal of helping to revive and extend African knowledge systems, translating them into modern media. And so I think about art really as a vehicle for spiritual exploration. It becomes a way to touch audiences directly, to bypass the conscious mind and all of the difficulties of dealing with the conscious ego, and really trying to touch audiences on a more primal level and introducing new ways of understanding the cosmic world in which we live and the kind of energetic beings and forces that are all around us that we can tap into when we consciously decide to move in that direction.
So one of the things that intrigued me about your site, Marcus, you talk about the tradition of the gatekeepers. And I wanted to get you to expand a little bit about that. I'll just quote it. It says, you write that you strive to revive the tradition of the gatekeepers, the lineage of queer African spirit workers, artisans, and designers. Could you speak a little bit about that, about maybe the role of these gatekeepers, and why you're trying to bring them back?
Yeah,
People to understand it.
no, that's a great question. And I would say the term gatekeepers is one that comes from Malajama Somé, who was a spiritualist from the Dagara tradition. And he, I think, was one of the first to really explain and articulate this idea about how indigenous African contexts have very unique perspectives about the spiritual purpose of homosexuality. So the idea is that because LGBT people can vibrate both masculine and feminine energies, we were seen to have this special relationship to the androgynous source from which the world emerges. And as such, we were tasked with maintaining the gates, or the physical, or the pathways between the physical and spiritual worlds. I mean, serving in this function as shamans, diviners, priests, etc. I'm interested in bringing back these traditions for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, I think they're an important part of an African understanding about how the world works, around how the different talents of all people have to be employed in order for a vibrant, spiritually rich society to exist. I mean, of course, in our current moment, we have the mainstream, let's say, Abrahamic religions that are violently expelling all gatekeepers. And even what I've found in my own personal life is that many of the African-based systems are flagrantly misreading their own traditions, and many have some homophobic tendencies as well. So one thing that I've been really thinking about deeply is about how to revive specifically gay African spiritual paths in order to rebalance the situation. And that's another reason why ancient Egypt is so important to me, because it provides an important grounding for this work. I mean, so I'm thinking about the entire pantheon of deities from the tradition. I mean, we have a figure like Hapi, who represents the fertility of the Nile River, but he was always represented as a man, but with a pregnant stomach and large breasts. So in a certain respect, this figure becomes almost the implementation of the perfectly realized human being as this fusion of masculine and feminine. And there are images of this figure at least from 1800 BC. So a question is, what would it mean to revive a tradition of thinking about these kinds of androgynous figures? I mean, even in some of the cosmologies, I mean, you have a text like the Book of Knowing the Evolutions of Ra, and you have this narrative about a deity who literally creates the world through ejaculating into his own mouth. I mean, it's a very graphic way of describing the intimate connection between the world, deity, human beings, and spirit. But it's a very potent metaphor that can shift how we understand our relationship to the world. I mean, and we have a sense of queerness, if you will, everywhere in nature. I mean, there's asexual reproduction, there's androgyny, there's homosexuality. I mean, so the question is, how can we understand the power and the spiritual messages behind these phenomena?
It's interesting. The Native American people, in other words, this is not just an African thing.
Exactly.
It's if you look in sort of many ancient traditions, they have a specific reference for what you're calling gatekeepers. I'm not that familiar with Some's work, but I recognize echoes of it in other things that I've checked out.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the two-spirit tradition, as you mentioned in the Native American context, will be one analog to what I'm describing here.
And it's almost like, how can humans, I guess, recognize and to some extent elevate the androgynous aspect of themselves?
Exactly.
Because we're all both male and female,
exactly.
beyond the physicality of ourselves. At least that's how I look at it.
Absolutely true.
You're also an African-American man, and a lot of the things that you're dealing with in terms of studies of Egypt to some extent come from Africa. So I'm also an African-American man, which is, I guess, obvious. And I wonder if you could speak about how that tradition maybe informs you. And let's start there, and then I'll ask a follow-up question. So I know that you've also written about Sun Ra, for example, Ishmael Reed, both people that I knew Sun Ra, for example, and I've read a lot of Ishmael Reed when I was younger. So obviously, you're vibing to the black thing. Say a little bit about that and what that means for you. And, I guess a larger question is, what does it mean for the world? But let's start with Marques.
Yeah, so, oh gosh, I mean, that's a broad question too. So what my relationship to African American tradition, I mean, so I think many things. I mean, I think, I would say we're such a dynamic lineage that fuses together so many other histories and stories. I mean, so obviously on one hand, we come from a melange of different African tribes, Yoruba, Mande, Bambara, Akan, etc., and with a smattering of European and Native American influences. But what I would say, one thing that I really appreciate, or one thing that I'm always in awe of with African American culture, is the deep the deepness of our spiritual strivings and the legacy in that regard that we've left to the world. So I would say when I step back and think about the tradition broadly, I would say there are three major intellectual and spiritual contributions that the tradition has made to global religion. So I would say on one hand, there's this idea about Pan-Africanism, kind of Pan-African revival, which is where my work certainly fits in very comfortably. But I would say starting with people like Martin Delany in the 1800s, who were also interested in the legacy of ancient Egypt, who was trying to draw connections, these global connections with Cuba, with Nigeria, with South America. And that impulse has literally traveled from the 1800s to today, where you see things like Oyatunji, the Yoruba revival village in the Carolinas, to hoodoo, which is a specifically African-American spiritual practice. And of course, it's probably worth mentioning that October is National Hoodoo Appreciation Month. So you have this Pan-African strand. You have, let's say, the Nation of Islam strand with connected traditions like the Moorish Science, 5% Nation, who've brought in a very strong understanding of what it means to be a people, a nation, thinking about everything from diet to understanding of ancient texts, to, I would say, finally, I would say what we call an Afro-Baptist Christianity, which is completely turned upside down all forms of traditional European Christianity, with contributions like the spirituals. I mean, a body of work that's unique everywhere in the world. Ideas around speaking in tongues, walking and talking with Jesus, and these kinds of things. So I would say these are all extremely powerful traditions that really, stand out when looked at on a world scale. And then thinking about the global influence of everything from, one could have a whole conversation just on music.
Yeah.
Gospel, funk, blues, hip hop, disco, house, etc. And even how those musics are the foundation for spiritual quests and spiritual paths, I think is really important. The political history, the influence of the civil rights movement, Black Panthers, the Black is Beautiful, that sort of thing. The inventions, the Lewis Latimers, George Carver's, the literature. So there's so many ways in which it's an embarrassment of riches. And it really, I think, is, not to, have any sort of ethnic narcissism here, but I think the tradition that we come from is one of the most powerful operating in the world right now.
And I think of the blues. There's something about the blues that is embraces turning suffering into hope, that is universal, and there's a feeling sense of it also, that is essential to being Black in America. Let's put it that way. It's too broad of a question. We're in the soup to be able to talk about what does it mean to be Black in the context of the world stage. But it's just interesting, wherever I go, people listen to the blues. They listen to African American music. I ask myself, what does this mean? Why aren't they listening to Beethoven, which some people say was Black? But anyway, I'm kind of digressing. But anyway, it's a broad question. So anyway, I thought I'd ask you. I wanted to hear your your take on it. Marques, we're living in a very confusing time here. And lots of different things are going on that or to some extent, it's like I turn on the news. There's all this destruction and devastation, for example, as we're talking now in Florida. There's stuff going on in Russia and everything like that. It's a confusing time. So tell me a little about your ritual practice and how it helps you maintain balance during this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say a lot of my practice, as I was saying before, is really about being as open as I can be to all of the cycles that are happening around and making sure I'm trying to align my world and my energy with these larger cycles. Much of, let's say, the ancient Egyptian tradition was based on what we could call a certain kind of shamanic astronomy. I mean, we have massive calendars and zodiacs, um, from the ancient context where you could see how the whole civilization was guided by understanding solar cycles, lunar cycles, precessional cycles, um, cycles of different planets, cycles of different stars. I mean, for instance, the star Sirius, and whose teliocal rising every year will mark the flooding of the Nile. So I've tried to reproduce that in my own way by keeping track of many different calendars, many different astronomical events, and trying to make sure my life is working in tandem with them as well. So on one hand, I have a daily practice where I'm attentive to and invoke a wide spectrum of deities, depending again on the specific energetic configurations of the day. I have my ancestor altar where I consciously refresh and provide attention to the figures in my family that have passed, larger cultural figures that are important to me, and ancestors that are unknown, that are still working, and whose presence is still felt in many different ways. I have monthly rituals where I try to understand the deities that are expressing themselves in a particular lunar month and try to really work with a particular figure and a particular energy over the course of the month to make sure I'm embedding the lessons and the laws and the rituals of those figures. I have a yearly practice that's marked by high energetic points of the year, like the solstices and the equinoxes, and making sure that my intentions and the things that I'm trying to manifest are in tune with the particular flow of the year. And then I have different altars or different altars that are dedicated to specific projects that I'm working on, where I try to meditate on the things that I'm manifesting, trying to understand the lessons or the purpose of some of the events or projects that I'm working on so that I can make sure that those things are also being produced in congruence with a larger divine purpose. So I would say that's probably the high level bird's eye overview. But it really is, again, thinking about cycles within cycles within cycles. I mean, because again, that's what our life is. Our lives are a particular cycle within a larger cultural cycle of African American culture, within a larger national cycle of American culture, within a larger cycle. So I'm constantly thinking about, as I said, how does this day fit into this month, into this year, into this phase of my life, into my life as a whole, and trying to create and perform rituals that are kind of constantly bringing me back into alignment and to remembering, again, my divine origin and destiny.
You know that this is a little bit simplistic, but it kind of reminds me of what I believe that ancient people did. Like if they were architects, for example, they didn't just build buildings. They were trying to think, well, where does this go? How does this fit into the divine pattern? This kind of listening and trying to incorporate all the different past, I'll call it deities, or trying to fit into the larger framework and see kind of what am I doing, what does what I'm doing represent, how can I sort of be of service and align myself with the larger spiritual forces, I guess I'll call it.
No, absolutely. I'll riff off of that. I mean, especially in the ancient Egyptian context, you see that very clearly. With if you let's say look at the Giza plateau, you have three pyramids that are perfectly aligned with the positioning of the three belt stars of Orion. So the idea is that we're not just going to build these things, but okay, they need to be specifically constructed so that they could be a machine for pulling down astral energy, divine energy, cosmic energy. They need to be oriented so that the energy of the directions can be pulled in appropriately. Because there are considerations around latitude and longitude that were also going into the construction of these things. So everything, again, was thought about within a cosmological frame. And everything that was done had to be constructed perfectly enough to fit within the larger framework. Because the idea was that these things have a meaning and have an energy, and anything that you create is emanating a certain kind of force, is emanating a certain kind of language, is emanating, and to use the Sun Ra language, is emanating a certain tone and a certain voice. And so you want that tone and voice to be something that will have optimal effects, that will help tune in to the resonance of human beings around and really elevate that vibration and not dampen the amplitude of it.
So in the write up that you and I created for this Sacred Inclusion Network exploration, you talk about this tradition and how it provides techniques for manifesting, fostering, empowerment, affecting transportation. There's a bunch of other things we talked about. Can you give us a sense of some of these techniques that you're going to be talking about this Saturday that we do this, and how people might apply them?
Sure.
Maybe an example.
Yeah, so some of the techniques that we'll work on, one would be a simple guided meditation. So how do you think about connecting with the source? How do you think about connecting with the spiritual guides, with the ancestors, with the kind of energies of this tradition in order to activate it? And I would say the most simple formula for ritual, I mean, is that it unfolds in a three-part way. You have a separation, basically a formal movement of from the mundane space to a ritual space.
Mm-hmm.
You have a certain kind of transformation that happens in the ritual space, and then you have a return where you bring back the knowledge into a new context. So really helping to understand what this three-part ritual formula means in an ancient Egyptian context, and how to actually start activating it so that you can see different results, so that you can see movement and shifts being made in energy. Also, we will work with hieroglyphs. I mean, so the hieroglyphics, one of the first complete human languages, and a very interesting one, a very mystical one, where you have words that are also images. I mean, so you have a system that can speak to both parts of the brain. The left brain, which is more linear and logical, the right brain, which is more creative, holistic, synthetic. So it's using these tools really that have been given to us to connect both parts of the brain, and to basically use that combined brain power to kind of project energy into the world and to receive it in turn. So I think those are two of the things that we will really dig into over the course of the session.
So, Marques, I want to give you an opportunity to sort of like toot your own horn, because I know that you have something that's coming up at the Esalen Institute. I know you've got some other artistic projects which we haven't talked about. What would you like to share with people in case they want to know more about your work? And of course, I'm going to put some of the particulars in the show notes. But
yeah, exactly. Thank you for the question. I would encourage people to go to my website, marquesredd.com, MARQUESREDD. And there you could see a write-up about all the different projects that I'm involved in, all the different things that I'm doing. Also coming up later this month, I will be doing a retreat at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, called Harnessing the Power of African Ritual for Creation. And this will happen from October 21st to 23rd. Look forward to seeing people there, and you can go to my website for more details.
Thank you, Marcus. Let me just say a little bit for folks who want to know more about, this particular event and also Sacred Inclusion Network. Simplest thing about the Sacred Inclusion Network is to go to our website and see what we're about, sacredinclusion.com. And a number of ways you can participate. We have these monthly explorations, one of which is Marcus is going to facilitate. And we also have a bunch of classes, like one on Sacred Inclusion Challenge, which is coming up very soon. How can you be more inclusive? What does it mean to be inclusive? What context should you be with not to be inclusion, for example? Anyway, that's that. Marcus, it's been a delight to talk with you. I'm really looking forward to your exploration on the, what date is it now? The 15th? Did I screw this up?
Yes, it's the 15th.
Thank you. The 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can see some information on the show notes. Thank you very much, Marcus, and shine on, brother.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward to seeing everybody then.